like also, first of all, thank you for the invitation to this anniversary. I'm very happy to be here 10 years later, also, like Willem. Maybe just a few words about the context in which the nationalist movements and this, all what was presented by Willem just before is taking place. And two things that I would like to mention in order to launch the discussion among us and with the audience afterwards. The first one is about the mechanisms that characterize Europe and the way the EU is run and the problems it raised more broadly. And the second point I would like to raise is about the European higher education area itself and how it developed over time and how this can maybe help understanding what is going on. So first of all, about Europe and the EU more specifically, I think that we shouldn't forget that there is quite a strong political and democratic deficit of the EU. And this is one of the weaknesses of the EU, and probably this may explain why it is so difficult for the EU to react to what is going on in the different countries. Willem just mentioned that the European higher education area and the European research area are much larger than the EU, but we should have in mind that the EU is now 28 countries, but that, let's say, 20 years ago, it was only 15 one. And that in between, the number of countries participating to the EU really increased. I don't want to say that it's bad, it's not at all the point, but at the same time that the EU grew, there was no real modification of the way the EU is functioning, of the rules in order to make decisions at the EU level. And bargaining and negotiating among 15 countries is not the same as bargaining and negotiating among 28 countries. And many of the weakness of the EU right now is based on this way the different countries have to manage together. On top of that, the countries which entered the EU in between increased the economic distance between the well-off countries and the less well-off countries. Again, I think it was great for the EU not to stop the process because of that. But if you don't change the instruments of steering, or if you don't adapt the steering capacity of the EU while having a wider range of situations, it's more and more difficult to govern this system and to be inclusive in the way you develop the system. And all that happen in a situation where the EU is suffering from a deficit of a democratical deficit, I would say. So of course we elect the European Parliament, but we don't elect the people sitting at the Commission of the European Commission. And people within the countries often feel like they do not control what is going on at the EU. Why the national countries are also playing with that. When they want to change something in one country, they say that it's that the European Commission is responsible for it, even if they are, in fact, in favor of that. And they increase this feeling within the population that the European Commission is making decisions against everybody, but not in favor of the country. So I think this is something we have to have in mind, that the way the EU is working has an influence in the development of nationalist movements. My second point, and I look at the clock, is about the European higher education area. And I would like to say that from my point of view, it still does not exist and never really existed. You started, Willem, with a quote of your speech on your paper 10 years ago. And I remember that at that point, I disagree with this conclusion. I agree with the fact that university or higher education policies in Europe looks like being converging because the discourse and the objectives of these policies were quite similar. But when you looked at the way they were implemented in the different countries, I came to the conclusion that, in fact, the way they are implemented increased the divergence among the European higher education systems. So similar discourses, but different ways of implementing, increasing the national strategies, trajectories of the single countries. And I think this is something which went even worse with the devolution of competencies to the regional level about higher education in Europe. This is the case in the UK, where you had this devolution, so that the way Scotland is running its higher education system is different from what is going on in in England, for instance. You have it, of course, in Spain, and we can see what happens today in Spain. It's also the case for Germany, where at the end of the 1990s, the lender of Germany were given much more leeway in order to define their higher education act and to have different ways of organizing on their university system and different ways of developing their own policies. And it's also the case for France, even if France is, of course, a centralized country. But the regional powers are always more important in terms of higher education policies. So I think this devolution to regional authorities also increased the heterogeneity of higher education systems within Europe. On top of that, and that will be the last mechanism I would like to mention in order to try to understand what is going on and why we are looking at so many different nationalist movements, I would like to come back to what I said yesterday about what I would call soft nationalism, the fact that I'm not speaking here of the very true nationalist movements that were mentioned this morning in Hungary or in Turkey or in Poland, but much more the fact that each European country is thinking of itself as in competition with the other European countries. And I think that's very obvious when you look at higher education. Looking at higher education reforms in Europe, you can see that each country is trying to get the best position on the competitive international scene and not thinking of how to better develop the European territory in general. When France is trying to develop a policy for excellence, like in Germany, it's not for Europe to be better or to be more competitive. It is for France to be more competitive within the European Union. So I think that this increase in competition that we had in the recent years, in fact, also increased this kind of national strategies from our governments, and that also led to more national feeling from the different population. So I think that's what I wanted to put in the discussion, and thank you very much.